B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, March 19th, 2019. Interesting testimony is surfacing. It indicates that in 2016, when James Comey said they had investigated all of Hillary Clinton's emails, and while she had been careless, there was no criminal behavior found. Well, I want to first acknowledge the source of what I'm about to tell you. It comes from a report on Fox News, and it was forwarded to me by the ultra-conservative legal group Judicial Watch. That said, I haven't seen anything about this, and the story broke last Thursday. I haven't seen it in the New York Times or the Washington Post, which I review every day, or any of the liberal independent media outlets that I review on a daily basis. So go ahead and discount this if you wish based on the source. But this is a report on testimony that was given before the House Judiciary Committee last summer. That's when it was under Republican control. Peter Strzok, S-T-R-Z-O-K, the former top FBI official who was put in charge of the Hillary Clinton email investigation and later was briefly in charge of the Trump investigation. He, of course, became infamous for the text messages with his girlfriend, a fellow FBI employee with whom he was having an extramarital affair. Her name is Lisa Page. So, the question was put to Peter Strzok. When you were investigating Hillary Clinton's emails, were you given access to Clinton Foundation-related emails as part of the investigation? The answer is not ambiguous. Quote from Strzok. We were not. We did not have access. My recollection is that the access to those emails were based on consent that was negotiated between the Department of Justice attorneys and counsel for Clinton. So there was a deal in place between the lawyers for Hillary Clinton and those at the Department of Justice who were setting the parameters for this investigation. And they basically said that emails related to the Clinton Foundation were off limits. Now, this is really critical because, as I have argued ever since that July day when Jim Comey went on television and said there will be no prosecution of Hillary Clinton, I was screaming, saying, did you look at the content of the emails, not just where the server was set up and whether it complied with Federal Open Records Act laws or not? And now we know the answer is nah. And as you may know, I have reviewed some of those emails. And let's be clear, these were emails that were not leaked or hacked by WikiLeaks or Russians or anybody else. These were the communications that occurred while Hillary Rodham Clinton was Secretary of State and while the foundation that bears her married name was operating at a very high level. And we know, we have seen the emails that show the Crown Prince of Bahrain made $1 million donation to the Clinton Foundation and let the people there know he urgently needed to meet with the Secretary of State. Schedules were cleared, the meeting took place, and there was a change in U.S. policy toward Bahrain. This was during the so-called Arab Spring. Now, this is a very significant form of collusion between this nominal nonprofit that's just out there doing good with Bill and Chelsea while Hillary was working for the government. And there were many other cases where the back and forth between Cheryl Mills and Huma Abedin, staffers for Hillary Clinton, with Doug Band and others at the Clinton Foundation. And to learn that this was just sealed off, never considered in the investigation. This is deeply troubling. And it unfortunately gives fodder to Trump and his allies. that the Mueller investigation is a witch hunt, that Hillary's the one who should have been investigated. And I hate to concede any point to Donald Trump. But if we're going to be intellectually honest, we have to in this case. At Truth Out the other day, Aaron J. Leonard published a really strong piece entitled, "Don't Let Mueller Restore Your Faith in the FBI." And he notes, as I have, that it's perverse that so many people have now taken to seeing the FBI as the staunch defender of justice and truth in this country, a kind of rehabilitation that has occurred ever since COINTELPRO in the 1970s, the reign of Bob Mueller after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, the widespread abuse of the rights of Muslims, the use of national security letters, the frame-up of so-called domestic terrorism suspects. And I encourage you to read this piece. I'm going to try to find Mr. Leonard and see if I can get him for an in-depth interview on the Peter B. Collins podcast here. But he makes excellent points about the agency's sordid history. And that Jim Comey and Bob Mueller are consistent with that sordid history. They are not exceptional to it. He writes, "We find ourselves now in a situation where people who had either despised or had a healthy skepticism of the FBI are now full of illusions about it. This is largely a consequence of Trump firing Comey in May of 2017 and what many of us see as clear obstruction of justice in that case. And while Trump has wrongly attacked the FBI in many respects, as you know, it really deserves complete top-to-bottom reform and reorganization. Bob Mueller making news as court documents released today in the case of Michael Cohen show that the Mueller team was already reading Michael Cohen's personal email in the middle of July of 2017. They got warrants based on the claim that he may have broken several laws, including being an unregistered foreign agent. That's one of the things they popped Paul Manafort for. The filings say Mueller's investigators were looking in Cohen's Gmail account for records on any funds or benefits he received from foreign governments or companies, as well as any files revealing efforts by Cohen to work on their behalf. Now, this story is not that exciting because they got a search warrant. They looked at his iCloud account in the middle of August of 17, and no charges were brought in that matter. Deutsche Bank got a full scrutiny from the New York Times. A piece they published today that runs almost 30 pages when you print it out shows the really ugly history. And to use the Donald's favorite term that he once applied to Hillary Clinton, Trump repeatedly schlonged Deutsche Bank, and then they kept loaning him more money. I mean, you go back to 1999, there's a case where he was accused or somebody forged the signature on a loan application. That loan was never funded. And Trump was not accused, and nobody on his team was. Then, Justin Kennedy, the son of the Supreme Court Justice who retired last year and created the opening for Brett Kavanaugh, Justin was one of the lead bankers for Donald Trump for several years. He helped him borrow money from Deutsche Bank, including on a Chicago project that, along with other debts, Trump defaulted. Now, in 2003, Deutsche Bank helped Trump's casino company sell hundreds of millions of dollars in bonds, and just a year later, Trump defaulted, leaving Deutsche Bank's clients with deep losses. It was just a year later that Justin Kennedy helped arrange the $640 million loan to build a skyscraper in Chicago. He defaulted, and then he sued Deutsche Bank. Trump is just amazing. And then, 3 years after his previous default, Deutsche Bank started lending to him again, this time through the private banking division. And they claim that, one silo of Deutsche Bank wasn't really paying attention to what the other silo was doing. And that the private wealth division was chasing Trump because he was famous. They thought it would lead to other similar clients. What I find refreshing about this is that the central role of Justin Kennedy is focused on in the New York Times Deep Dive. When Rachel Maddow reported on this last night on her TV program, she curiously left out Justin Kennedy. I really don't know why. She focused on a woman, Rosemary Vrablick, who was Trump's private banker at Deutsche Bank after Justin Kennedy. I also want to tip you to an excellent report in the New York Times today. It's an interactive feature with a lot of good graphics, and I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast for your easy access. It recaps the recent history of Pacific Gas and Electric Company, the rogue utility that I keep talking about. They're in bankruptcy here in Northern California. This is a result of the wildfires of the last 2 years, and this report very clearly depicts graphically for you how the wildfires were caused by extreme negligence by this utility. And that's why I want to see it broken up. I'd love to see public ownership of PG&E, and it is a possibility in the current political climate here in California. Another great read today that came across my desk from the New Republic was published last week under the byline of Mark Weisbrot, and he gives great detail about the ugly parade of characters who are part of Trump's coalition of the willing or the billing, focused on regime change in Venezuela. And today, Jair Bolsonaro, the newly elected strongman right-winger from Brazil, who supports overthrowing Maduro in Venezuela, he supports Trump's border wall, he supports everything Trump does, and I've declared this the Thug Summit. Bolsonaro is just one of the figures. This article takes a look at the government of Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez. He owes us his job because Hillary, after there was the overthrow of the democratically elected president Zelaya in 2009, Hillary made sure that he couldn't come back. And that sealed the deal for Hernandez, who has been running the country since. Then we have Colombia under President Ivan Duque, the protege of former president, now kingmaker, Uribe. U.S. diplomatic cables released last year showed widespread concerns among U.S. officials about Uribe's ties to drug traffickers, and they suspect that his successor is in a similar position. Then in Argentina, President Macri, another influential hard-right coalition member, owes favors to Washington. His cozy relationship with Trump helped him score the biggest IMF loan in history, $50 billion last year. Then there's Lenin Moreno, the president of Ecuador, who is eager to boot Julian Assange out of his embassy in London, and he got support from U.S. interests as well. And the president of Paraguay. Well, his party, the Colorado Party, ruled the country for 61 years, the majority of it under the dictatorship of Stroessner, and the U.S. worked with the Organization of American States to help legitimize the 2012 coup that brought the president of Paraguay to power today. So I think this is an excellent recap of the dark cast of characters who are all in with Trump on regime change in Venezuela. They did it again. The Republican-dominated Supreme Court backed Trump with a strict interpretation of a federal immigration law. And it is absurd because they're basically saying that if you were convicted of a crime and you were not a legal citizen of the United States, even if that crime was 30 years ago, even if it was, shoplifting a box of candy, that you are subject to deportation today. Sam Alito, writing for the majority, just said, it's in the law. but Justice Stephen Breyer summarized his dissent from the bench, which is a way of signaling deep disagreement. He said, "The greater importance of the case lies in the power that the majority's interpretation grants the government, a power to detain persons who committed a minor crime many years before, and it is a power to hold those persons perhaps for many months without an opportunity to obtain bail. So they're treating a jaywalker like a murderer or a rapist." And from the ACLU, Cecilia Wang, quote, "For 2 terms in a row now, the Supreme Court has endorsed the most extreme interpretation of immigration detention statutes, allowing mass incarceration of people without any hearing simply because they are defending themselves against a deportation charge." This is cruel. It is brutal. It is un-American. And it is Trumpian. Meanwhile, a 40-year-old Mexican immigrant who had made it to the Las Palmas Medical Center in El Paso died yesterday of flu-like symptoms, liver failure, and he is the 4th person to die after being apprehended by our Border Patrol in recent months. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Have I recently mentioned Faith Peoples? She is a staunch supporter and has multiple subscriptions, along with people like Paul Tomaselli, Wendy Gebauer, Joey Perillo, who's been having a few tech problems accessing the podcast. I hope you got that fixed, Joey. These are people who donate $5 a month. And if you're able to do that, I wish you would. Just visit peterbcollins.com, find the menu button, click on that, then click on Become a Subscriber. You'll land on the sign-up page, and your choices are easy. $5, $10, $20 a month, the $50 annual subscription. If you give me a continental U.S. mailing address with your new annual subscription, I will reward you with our bonus book, which is currently Trump on the Couch by psychiatrist Justin Frank. And if you're allergic to PayPal, I understand, you can use the U.S. mail and address it to Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915, Box 150660, San Rafael, 94915. Over at Shadowproof, Kevin Gostola reminds us that Chelsea Manning has been jailed for more than a week now. She's locked up in Alexandria, Virginia, and she has refused to testify before the federal grand jury investigation into WikiLeaks. And Kevin uses this as an opportunity to take us back to the Nixon era, when the Pentagon Papers were published. Dan Ellsberg leaked them. Mike Gravel, a senator, read some of them into the federal record. They were published by the Washington Post and the New York Times. And in the crackdown that followed, the Justice Department targeted Neil Sheehan, the Times reporter who was first to write about the Pentagon Papers, but they especially leaned on Samuel Popkin, an assistant professor who taught at Harvard. He was a friend of Dan Ellsberg. He happened to be in Hong Kong and completely unaware when the Pentagon Papers were initially leaked. But he said they took him to the grand jury, they repeatedly called him to appear, subjected him to hours of broad, speculative, unrestrained questioning. It became apparent to me, Popkin said, that the government was engaged in a fishing expedition. And he was only released when the grand jury was suddenly dismissed, and that's probably what will happen to Chelsea Manning unless something shifts in the meantime. The state of West Virginia has taken a novel approach to reeling in the criminal enterprise known as the Roman Catholic Church. The Attorney General has filed a civil suit against a retired top bishop and the only Catholic diocese in the state, saying that they knowingly employed pedophiles. They say that the church and the officials failed to conduct adequate background checks for employees of Catholic camps and schools, didn't disclose the inherent danger to parents who purchased its services for their children. And as I mentioned, it's a civil suit, not a criminal suit, and it's brought under the state's Consumer Credit and Protection Act. That is quite a novel approach to dealing with this criminal enterprise. I was shocked when I saw this. The state of Missouri's Senate last Thursday passed a bill that would fully nullify any federal gun control regulation. Here's the language. All federal acts, laws, executive orders, administrative orders, court orders, rules, and regulations, whether past, present, or future, which infringe on the people's right to keep and bear arms as guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the United States and Section 23 of the Missouri Constitution, shall be invalid in this state, shall not be recognized by this state, shall be specifically rejected by this state, and shall be considered null and void and of no effect in this state. This is sweeping. And if I'm correct, Missouri already has some of the most relaxed gun laws. I believe you can open carry without a permit or even any proof that you were trained on the weapon that you're carrying. Now, this bill has only passed through the state Senate on a party line vote of 23 to 10, and the Republicans have a majority of 24 to 10 in the state Senate. So there was one person absent or voting present. Now, the population in their House of Representatives, their assembly, is much larger. 116 Republicans, 47 Democrats. But those 47 Democrats, can they expect enough Republicans to defect to block the passage of this law? And I believe there is a Republican governor. It's a trifecta state. It even bans all state employees from enforcing or attempting to enforce any acts running counter to the proposed law. When we think of how New Zealand is responding to the mass shooting at 2 mosques last Friday, promising to implement new gun control regulations as soon as 10 days from now. And here we see the state of Missouri wanting to essentially create a wild, wild west with no gun laws whatsoever. This is shocking. It truly is. On to the Democratic presidential sweepstakes. Bernie Sanders made a claim, quote, "Not one major Wall Street executive went to jail for destroying our economy in 2008 as a result of their greed, recklessness, and illegal behavior. No, they didn't go to jail. They got a $1 trillion bailout." So this was assigned to the fact checker at the Washington Post, Glenn Kessler, who gave it 2 Pinocchios. He said that Bernie has a point, but he denies that Wall Street got a $1 trillion bailout. So in rides Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone, who goes to the archives and establishes that the range of the bailout was anywhere from $7.7 trillion to $29 trillion. That is, unless you exclude the role of the Federal Reserve in the bailouts in 2009 and beyond. Hawaii Congresswoman and presidential candidate gets a once-over with heavy-handed smears in The Guardian today. The headline reads, "Who is Tulsi Gabbard, the progressive 2020 hopeful, praised by Steve Bannon and the right?" And I just find this so far out of bounds. I have my own questions about Tulsi Gabbard. Why did she go along with her daddy in blasting gays and lesbians opposing same-sex marriage? Well, she moved on from that when she was about 23, and she is now 38 years old. And I recognize it is part of her past, but I think that this is very opportunistic to dig up information on people because it is convenient to help undercut the sole candidate who is against regime change wars. And The Guardian notes that, but they add this attack. She opposes military interventions abroad with a rare credibility of intent, arguing against foreign interventions and casting doubt on the wealth of evidence that Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator, used chemical weapons on his own people. Now, if you're a regular listener here, you know that I'm skeptical of the claims that Assad used chemical weapons, in particular nerve agents. And in Ghouta and other communities, there is a great deal of information that supports the skeptics. But of course, the corporate media has a consensus view, and they've already declared that Assad was guilty. And so the fact that she met with him is then another reason to mark down her candidacy. Quote, she has staked out a split identity as both a foreign policy hawk on Islamic extremism and a dove on regime change. Now, that first part is true, and I still do hold Tulsi Gabbard accountable because as a member of Congress, she criticized Barack Obama, and she joined the right-wingers for failing to call Islamic extremism Islamic terrorism. And I think that that was a mistake on her part. But for my own money right now, I am willing to evaluate each candidate based on what they present for this campaign and for America's future. And while Elizabeth Warren has hit some turbulence and the claim of Native American heritage continues to dog her in some ways, she's out there fighting hard, and yesterday she issued a call to end the Electoral College and use the popular vote to determine the outcome of presidential elections. Now, I genuinely support that, but it takes a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. There is an end run where states can say that they will commit all of their electors to the winner of the popular vote, and that is gaining ground, and that appears to be the best way to deal with that issue. Related to our elections, I want to direct you to a good piece at Who, What, Why today under the byline of Jennifer Cohn. And she points out that a new generation of electronic voting machines that are called hybrids have serious problems, including the fact that if you use the machine to mark your ballot and then that same machine counts your ballot, well, audits have shown that it is possible to insert a different ballot before it is counted. So these are serious issues. And right here in California, we are moving to buy a new generation of machines, particularly for tabulating paper ballots. And these are issues that really need to be aired out. We've had too little transparency in the processes going back to the Help America Vote Act that followed the debacle in Florida in 2000, and we have to look carefully at the implications of what we're doing. And despite the most recent showing of election fraud around absentee ballots in North Carolina, where they were handed out and collected by political operatives in violation of the law, but a very effective way of defrauding an election. Here in California, there's a move to use more and more mail-in ballots. And in some communities, they have the option to vote by mail entirely. My San Francisco Chronicle today editorializing, all mail elections do have significant benefits. They increase turnout. They result in cost savings. They're more convenient for most voters. And the Voters' Choice Act here in California allows all California counties to adopt this model for the 2020 election. Counties can mail every registered voter a ballot, expand early voting options, and shrink the number of polling places they run in favor of a few full-service voting centers. But there are real issues. If you mail every registered voter a ballot, there are going to be a lot of loose ballots out there. And the only way we have of confirming that a mail-in ballot came from the right voter is the use of signatures. And the poll workers, the voting officials who examine those, they don't have any expertise to decide whether the signature on the back of an envelope is the same as the one that was given on a voter registration form. And people do change their signatures over time. So I have a lot of concerns about the integrity of our elections, and we seem to be pretty oblivious to them. Facebook has agreed to overhaul its targeted advertising system. They have resisted for years, particularly after people complained that housing opportunities, rentals, and purchase could be steered away from minorities or any kind of person that the seller or the landlord didn't want to sell or lease a place to. And in job opportunities, the same kind of use of the demographics and other advertising criteria that you use on Facebook can be used to directly discriminate. And they promise by the end of this year they will have alternatives available that do not permit discrimination. I want to salute Otis Boone today. He spent 8 years in New York State prisons for a robbery that he didn't commit. He was falsely convicted because of what they called the cross-race effect in eyewitness identification. Mr. Boone is black. The victims who had their cell phones snatched by a knife-wielding man picked him out of separate police lineups. But after he got a second trial, based on an appeal, the trial was held last month, and they presented evidence that Boone was a mile away from one of the robberies 5 minutes before it occurred. He was acquitted on March 1st after spending 7 of the last 8 years behind bars. And you should know that about 70% of the 364 convictions that have been overturned with DNA evidence in the United States since 1992 involved eyewitness misidentification. This is one of the weakest ways to base a conviction, particularly for a serious crime. And finally today, we say a fond farewell to the king of the surf guitar. Dick Dale passed away in Hollywood last weekend at the age of 81. We don't have details on his death, but I do understand that it was a pretty miserable exit for Dick Dale, and I'm sorry to hear that. He entertained us with the sound of the surf guitar that was picked up by the Beach Boys and that whole Southern California surf craze in the early 1960s. It certainly affected and infected me, and I've always had great respect for his work with the guitar. YouTube won't let me play a song, but I've put a link in the show file for this podcast to one of my Dick Dale favorites. It's called Ghost Riders in the Sky. Hope you'll click on it and crank it up and enjoy it. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.